There are killings of civilian men, sexual abuse, dismembering bodies, lootings, setting villages on fire. Sahel is actually the global terrorism hotspot. It is the place in the world where most civilians are dying.
Welcome back to Fractured. Today we are looking into one of the most important and least understood security crises in the world. We will look at it from the perspective of people on the ground. We will look at it from the perspective of the human movement, but also a very special lens on the involvement of Wagner's group, now Africa Corps. We are going to Mali and the broader Sahel region. And to explain more about the situation there is a journalist working with Associated Press, Monika Prończuk. Monika, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure.
Monika was already our guest in season 4, episode 21 on the human movement and migration trends in Western Africa. So if you're interested in this topic, you should check it out on any of the podcasting platforms. Monika, it seems almost necessary to start this podcast by bringing the background of the conflict in Mali to the audience. Who is fighting whom there and why?
Well, the situation is quite complex, but I think I'd like to start by saying what you said, one of the most important and least understood security crises. It is also the one that is impacting civilian the most. For the second year in a row, Sahel is actually the global terrorism hotspot. It is the place in the world where most civilians are dying as a result of widely understood terrorism, which includes extremist groups. So in Mali has been fighting an insurgency since 2012. And there are a couple of actors in this insurgency. There is DINIM, which is an Al-Qaeda-linked group. And there are also Tuareg. So Tuaregs are a minority in Mali. It's an ethnic minority which lives across Sahel countries, and they have been for decades fighting for their independence. And let's say the main movement is called FLA, which is Liberation Front for Azawad. Azawad is the name of their dream country that they would like to establish. And so what happened in 2012 is that the activities of DINIM, which has been sort of has been active, but not to a very large degree, compounded with the activities of FLA, and both movements had a short-term alliance. And this was the start of what is still ongoing, of violence against the Malian army, but also against civilians, and insecurity, and what now has been like over 15-year insurgency. So in the meantime, those groups stopped cooperating with each other. Then there were periods where they're cooperating again, but on a very sort of limited scale, which brings us into last month and the reason why we're talking, which is that a series of the largest coordinated attacks when we say on Mali, we mean on the Malian government and on the Malian army, again brought by an alliance between DINIM and FLA. And so that has really shook the country because the violence and security have been there. Bamako has been largely spared, Bamako the capital. And there was one attack on the airport last year, which was already quite like shocking for many people. But what happened in April was of a much bigger scale. So just simultaneously, you had those images that were also broadcast on social media, also by Janim and Janim supporters, NFLA supporters, where you just like had Malian army retreating from very key places, including Kidal, which is a key city in the north, which was taken away from the government by FLA and then reclaimed with the help of, at the time, Wagner Group in a very spectacular and publicized way. And this is the city that has fell again to FLA. And you had those images of Russian fighters as well, kind of retreating, and Malian army. The defense minister was killed in one of the attacks, which was, something that we have not seen before. And and situation since then stabilized, but the cities that have been lost remained in the hands of the FLA and Geneva.
Mm-hmm. So how much truth is in the statement made by Africa Corp that those events from April were actually an attempt of a coup supported by the Western powers, as they put it?
Well, not much. But I think that, one more thing for the viewers and the listeners, Mali is a former French colony. And as are other Sahel countries, Niger and Burkina Faso. And they have a very complicated relationship. France has a very complicated relationship with these countries, especially with Mali, where there was a large French military operation that was fighting Janim and other extremists until a current military government took power in a military coup, and then they kicked the French out.
Mm-hmm. So was it a political decision to kick the French out? Was there any support or, fatigue by their presence in the region?
I think there are like a couple of factors. Ultimately, it was a political decision made by the military government, and it was in line with their narrative. And the narrative was that they are reclaiming Mali's sovereignty. On the other hand, there is quite a lot of fatigue of the population with France. So even though those countries have been independent for decades, France has retained quite a strong economic and political domination in the region. And it's something that is often referred to as France-Afrique, which is this sort of like complex web of dependencies, which are not official, are not formalized, but they still exist. And so all of the governments, which let's say French government has maintained very close relationships with the governments in power in those countries until military coups, because all of the free countries have undergone military coups in the last years. And those previous governments in those countries were the ones that were backed by France, were often quite corrupt. They were elected in a democratic way, but they were not behaving as democratic governments. These are countries that are very rich in natural resources, especially gold, but the populations remain very poor. And so while the elites were basically monopolizing the economic benefits, and France has been seen as a partner that was accepting and even backing this situation in return for those governments maintaining French presence in the economic sphere. So there was this image of local elites cooperating with friends to kind of, in the end, steal resources away from the population. There is a grain of truth in it. Of course, it's much more complex than just that, um, than just saying, friends together with corrupt governments have been stealing away resources. But there is a grain of truth in that. And definitely when the insecurity was increasing, uh, it was quite easy to blame it on France because they were there and they were supposed to be fighting and defending Mali from extremists. And while they were there, insecurity was worsening. However, after they got kicked out, the situation got much, much worse. So that's an argument that has sort of been, I think, combated by reality, because once and of course it's not just because the French got kicked out and that the insecurity worsened, but it was one of the factors. All of those three countries sort of replaced the support of the French military with the support of first private Russian mercenaries, Wagner Group, now Africa Corps, which is under direct command of Russian Defense Ministry. In all three countries, the insecurity has gotten much, much worse, to the point, as I said in the beginning, the region became the world's worst place for terror when it comes to terrorism for civilians. So this is, let's say, the big picture.
Yeah, in a nutshell, I understand it's very complicated. So, Monika, you mentioned that basically Africa Corps, Wagner's group, entered Mali and generally the Sahel region once the French withdrew or were forced to withdraw. What do we actually know about Africa Corps? What kind of people they are? Are they mercenaries? Are they soldiers? What do we know?
I think there are many things that we don't know. And I think it's also worth mentioning for our readers sorry. It's also worth
You're a writing
mentioning.
journalist.
It's also worth mentioning that Mali, but Niger and Burkina Faso as well, are extremely hard to access as journalists, as civil society, human rights observers. So it's very difficult to establish what is going on in those places, especially outside of the capitals and big cities. What we know is that a lot of Wagner fighters basically were redirected under the command of Africa Corps. We don't know if it's all of them. We know that Africa Corps is now under direct command of the Russian Defense Ministry, which makes it an official unit of the Russian army. That is a crucial difference with Wagner Group, which was obviously very heavily Kremlin influenced and linked to the Kremlin, but was not part of the official Russian government. They are, which also means that now, and that was the key point about the transition, was that Wagner Group was obviously being paid by those governments, right, for their support and their presence. And now this money is flowing directly to the Kremlin, money and gold mining concessions, which is another currency. And there was a lot of hope among the population and among experts once the switch was happening, which was last summer. Wagner has been notorious for human rights abuses. In general, the strategy that they were pursuing together with the Malian army was just basically destroying all the villages and killing civilians who are suspected of having any connection to the extremists. I think when we say an Al-Qaeda linked group, people imagine images that that have been created of Islamic fighters in our heads by pop culture, but by what we've seen in other regions of the world. In Sahel, it is often not the leaders, but the people that are joining are often very desperate, very, very poor young men who have no other way of making money, which is not a justification, but just to give the audience a little bit of a big picture here. And so, and these are local men, right? These are not fighters that are imported somewhere from Afghanistan. So obviously, these people are going to have a lot of links with the local population. They will have a family in the village, usually a very extended family. They come from like a very specific ethnic group. So the strategy that was implemented by Wagner and the Malian government was to basically destroy anyone who has any sort of connection, which is like a very big proportion of the population.
Yeah, it is always like basically a mass responsibility suddenly, right? It's because my uncle of my brother joined the group, therefore I am suddenly responsible as well.
Yes, and even more than that, just because uncle of my brother gave water to the fighters 2 days ago, I am responsible. So this was there was hope that once Wagner becomes Africa Corps or is being replaced by Africa Corps, which is under direct command of Russian government, maybe they would start acting in a way that's more compatible with international law. That has not happened. It is very difficult to report directly on what is happening and what they are doing, especially in the remote parts of Mali. But in December, I went to the border between Mauritania and Mali, where there are thousands of very recent refugees from Mali who have fled Africa Corps. So I went there specifically because to find out what Africa Corps has been doing, because it is impossible to get access to the areas where they're operating in the countryside.
Were you on Mali's side or on the Mauritanian?
No, on the Mauritanian side.
So safer.
Well, theoretically, I mean, it is a green border, so there are no border checks. So yes, it is safer because it is Mauritania, but you could just cross into Mali and you wouldn't realize you're in Mali. I mean, I was like 1 kilometer away from the border in the forest, and because that's where the informal settlements were from of the very recently arrived people. And yes, and I mean, all of them told me that Africa Corps is continuing Wagner's strategy. There are killings of civilian men, sexual abuse, dismembering bodies, lootings, setting villages on fire. And so when it comes to strategy, I don't think we can say there is much difference between Wagner and Africa Corps. They are also their big job, the one that's the most advertised, is protecting convoys with fuel. So since September, Jenim has imposed a so-called fuel blockade on Bamako, which means they are attacking basically trucks transporting fuel to Bamako. And one of the very big jobs of our Africa Corps has been making sure that there is fuel coming to Bamako. And, they have been succeeding because fuel has been getting into Bamako. And since September, we've been waiting for the moment when fuel completely runs out, and that has not been the case. There are periods where, of course, it's very expensive, but there are periods where there is like very little of it, but we haven't reached a situation yet where there are like absolutely no supplies.
Mm-hmm. Monika, you are talking about the situation on the ground, about Africa Corps getting the influences, not only being paid for their services, but also having access to the gold mines. how is the situation, from what you heard from people at the border, for them specifically? You mentioned that it's basically massive punishment for everybody who somehow supported or even gave water to a Jenin fighter. But what is specifically happening on the ground? What kind of gravity of atrocities are we talking about?
Again, I think it's very difficult to know the scale. When I was there, I was shocked by the stories that I heard, but it's hard to give you exact numbers and statistics. I can tell you that what I have heard are very, very grave human rights abuses, and not even against people who supported Jenin fighters or who gave water to Jenin fighters, but of people who belong to specific ethnic groups. So FLA, these are Tuareg minority. So the Tuaregs are the ones that are being targeted, and then the other ethnicity that's being targeted by the government forces is the Fulani ethnic group, which has been historically the most discriminated against and then neglected by the central government. And this is why many members of the Fulani community have joined Janim, but obviously not all. And so this is why sort of the strategy has been to target Fulani, especially Fulani men, even those that have had nothing to do with Janim. The stories I heard were really shocking, and I think it's partly because it is happening in Mali in very remote places that we don't have access to. This is why the world is not more shocked by them. Stories, and I got I was shown videos and recordings of villages being burned down to the ground, people that were beheaded, killed, their organs were being taken out, and then just this absolute impunity, because those people have absolutely no one to go to complain about these actions. We have to imagine that both Fulani and Tuareg, they're semi-nomad groups, which means they often change where they live, or they live in very small villages, which are basically more like settlements of multiple members of the same family. And they're very, very far away from the central government. They sometimes do not speak Bambara or French, which are the main languages in Mali. They have no contact with the government or with the authorities. And so, especially when Malian soldiers, because it is often Malian soldiers together with Africa Corps, arrive in their village and start raping and killing people, there's absolutely no one that they can go to. And this is why they flee. I think the story that definitely will stay with me for the longest was this teenage girl that I met, who she was raped by Russian soldiers, and she was basically dying. We were brought to her by her family, who wanted to tell her story. But when we arrived, we saw her state, and well, she basically looked already dead. She had soaring fever, eyes were glazed over, there were like flies landing on her mouth. She was 14. And we brought her to the nearest clinic of Doctors Without Borders, and they saved her life. And this is afterwards. We obviously we talked to the family afterwards, but they have not brought her to a doctor before because they didn't have the resources, but because also the issue of sexual violence and survivors of sexual violence is veiled in deep shame in this community. So they were, there is one refugee camp at the border which is full. And so the people who arrived recently um, are either staying in those informal settlements or with local families. And this specific family was staying with a Mauritanian family, and they were too ashamed to tell their hosts what happened. We were the first people that they told what happened, and yeah, that so so they told us that Russian soldiers arrived together with Malian soldiers, and they killed the uncle of the girl and beheaded him, and then they took the girl into one of the tents and they raped her, um, and she developed an infection. Um, we have met other survivors, but I think her story is the one that touched me the most, because she was just so young, and because she almost died, also because of the shame that surrounds sexual assault.
Uh, Monika, are those atrocities happening on both sides? Are we even able to say? Because as you mentioned, there's basically no entrance to the country.
We assume they are happening. We assume that both sides are committing human rights abuses. This is what the UN says. This is what experts are saying. Um, it's it is very hard to quantify, but ACLED, which is an organization that focuses on trying to quantify armed conflict and its effect on civilians, um, did publish some data that suggests that in recent years, more civilians in Sahel in general died from the hands of government allied forces. So that's not just the army. There are also self-defense militias, the Russian the Russian fighters. So more civilians died from the hands of government affiliated sources than from extremists. Which is not to say, right, that the extremists are not committing abuses, because they are. And even in last weeks, after the series of those coordinated attacks in April that we started our discussion with, there were massive executions of civilians by extremists. What the people that I've met at that specific border, which were mostly from the Fulani and Tuareg communities, what they told me was that when extremists came into their villages, they were looking for specific people. So they would have this one man they would be looking for, and they would take them away. When the Malian army with the Russians came to the village, they were just killing or abusing everyone indiscriminately. But again, these are like two ethnic minorities that are directly targeted by the Malian army and the Russians. So if we would go to a village of Bambara people, we would probably hear the same, but from the hands of the extremists.
Monika, it is interesting to me. How do people actually know that this is Africa Corp, Wagner's group? As you mentioned, some people do not speak the main languages. So how can they say with the certainty that this is the case? I understand that some of the soldiers are white, probably most of them, right? Is this the indicator?
So the indicator is definitely white soldiers that are accompanied by the Malian soldiers. And from what we know, there are no other white soldiers. There are no other groups of white people fighting with the Malian government at the moment. They also, I mean, they would describe them sometimes wearing uniforms that are separate, distinct from the uniforms of the Malian army. And they would also describe black soldiers together with the white soldiers who are not Malian, or at least were speaking different languages than the Malian army. And so this is more like an assumption game. I would say, it's 99.9% those people certainty that this is Africa Corps. Those people have also been living in this situation for years, so they do know very well what Wagner is, and it is in many cases the same people that have been coming to their villages for years now. And then one person that I spoke to told me they remember the word that the white soldiers kept on repeating when they were pointing at them, and the word was pies, which is well, actually,
That would be Polish.
exactly. Well, I went like down the rabbit hole because I speak a bit of Russian, but um, pies means dog in Polish. Dog in Russian is sabaka, but pies is a pejorative term that can be used. It's basically a pejorative term to say a dog, but it can be used to describe people, and it actually does come from Polish. So that's something that I learned. But okay, so this was, for example, in that case, I was 100% sure that, right, these were Russians. But these people have been living in this situation for decades, and especially for years, and especially the community leaders, they're like well aware of the dynamics and of the political dynamics as well. So um, it's a very hierarchical society. So very often, also among the people that have been displaced, I would also speak to local community leaders that were displaced with them, who kind of also speak on behalf of the community, and they are usually quite well educated, and they're the ones who could tell you with certainty whether these were Russians or not. So this is
Very
how.
interesting. Monika, you mentioned that people basically do not have anybody to really go to tell about their situation, file a complaint, formal complaint. The UN independent expert on human rights in Mali, Eduardo González Cueva, I hope I'm not mispronouncing, he asked twice to be let into the country to report on the situation. And what was very surprising to me was the blind answer and explanation for not letting him in, which is, and I believe I'm actually quoting your article right now. He apparently said that Mali's government considers investigations into alleged abuses as, quotation, inconvenient and harmful to the morale of the troops. That was a real shocker to me, that you can say it basically blindly, admit that your troops are committing war crimes.
I think that is like the most shocking element is the complete impunity. And of course, there's impunity across the world. But if you look at the crimes that are war crimes that are being committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine, there is a tribunal that's set up. There is a concerted effort by international organizations, human rights lawyers, to try at least to gather evidence. I'm not saying that effort is not there in Mali, but it is much more difficult, and there's less public attention on it, while actually the numbers of people who are victims of war crimes are extremely high. The UN has a very limited presence in Mali. The current government also asked most of the UN to leave the country in 2023. And since then, they have a very limited visibility of what's happening. And it is sad to say, but it just seems that no one among the powerful of the world cares enough to just pay any attention to what's happening in Mali. And the people that do care don't have enough resources, and they don't have enough power to actually try to bring anyone to justice.
We have around, I don't know again how accurate those numbers is, because as you're saying, the UN presence is very limited there, but we have around 300,000 internally displaced people inside Mali. So people who had to flee their homes to other regions because of the situation there. What about the other countries people go to? You mentioned Mauritania. Where are they, and what is the situation there for them?
So there are refugees from Sahel countries all across the region. I'm based in Dakar. They're also here. They are in Abidjan, which is the economic hub of West Africa, and where it's, let's say, easiest to get a job. In Mauritania, the people I spoke to, they have just arrived, so their situation was very precarious. They were living in makeshift settlements. They were depending on humanitarian organizations for like water and food deliveries, and we know in general humanitarian world has been hit very hard with diminishing resources last year because of aid cuts, and definitely Mauritania is not the priority. So even those organizations don't have enough resources. Some people try to go to Europe, but that's a minority. The vast majority stays in the region. The most vulnerable, who cannot, travel too long, would stay in the country or at the borders, like at the border with Mauritania, just because they don't have money or the energy or the enough, or even like enough determination to kind of try to go somewhere further. So that would often be older people, sick people, injured people, people with disabilities. I also have met a father with a 3-year-old girl who was wounded by in a drone attack on their house from the Malian army, and he was there at the only clinic which was run by Doctors Without Borders, which was not only catering to like tens of thousands of refugees that arrived from Mali into Mauritania, but also to local population, just because the health infrastructure in that region is very scarce. And so he, for example, didn't have any way to continue his journey further on, because he needed to make sure his 3-year-old daughter lived, right? So so let's say these are like the main migration patterns, but I'd really like to underline that there's a lot of people who stay within the borders of their countries. And I also went to Burkina Faso, which is another Sahel country, and I have met there in secrecy people that have been displaced from the countryside or more remote places into the capital, and they fled extremist violence, and they had to hide because the government wanted to maintain the image of a safe country. So they were like a living reminder of this insecurity, and they like were living in hiding in their own country, in their own capital, because for the government, which was supposed to protect them, it was uncomfortable that they were there.
It is an extremely complicated situation in the region, because people from Mali are escaping to the neighboring country, but inside Mali there are also refugees from Burkina Faso, from Niger. So I assume their situation is even more complicated and worse than people are native to Mali, right?
Yeah. And again, like the resources are so scarce also of humanitarian organizations, and both the UN and humanitarian organizations have just a lot of limitations on what they can do, not just in terms of documenting war crimes, but in terms of like what they can do to help refugees and internally displaced people, because all those military governments are obsessed with tightly controlling the image and the narrative. So they don't even want humanitarian workers to come and see the worst conditions of refugees and internally displaced people.
I'm just looking into my notes, so I would like to correct myself, because apparently it's around 400,000 internally displaced people in Mali, and on top of it, it's around 300, a little bit more than 300 of them displaced in other countries. Monika, to finish the episode, I would like to talk a little bit about the responsibility for this situation. Obviously, it's a very, very complex situation right now, and it's not gonna end soon, probably, even though the last few days, apparently there has been some kind of a coalition between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to actually together fight Jenin in Sahara Desert. But I assume that this is still in developing. But talking about the responsibility, obviously, there is responsibility of the government, right, towards their citizens. But what about the Africa Corps? As you mentioned, they are part of the Russia's Ministry of Defense. So the natural thing would be to basically believe that they, meaning Russia's government, is also responsible for what is happening, right, in the region. They probably know and allow that.
Oh, 100%. They certainly know and allow and encourage. I mean, this is really now a part of an official part of the Russian army. So there is absolutely no way that the Kremlin does not know what's happening. This was partly my motivation to try to get some firsthand accounts of those atrocities, was to kind of document it, because international law experts told me that Russia has direct responsibility for what's happening to those civilians. I think it's just a matter of international political will. There has been a case in the International Criminal Court, which has been basically stagnating for the past, I don't know how many years.
Is it against Africa Corps or Russian?
No, it's against the Malian. It's against the Malian army, but let's say like part of the case is Africa Corps. Wagner Group has been promoting their atrocities on social media and publicizing it widely. And it's another way in which lawyers say that they could be brought to justice. But there is no one straightforward technique to bring any sort of justice for the Malian people and to bring perpetrators to justice and make them pay for what they did.
They're doing basically exactly the same thing in Ukraine, right? Recording, therefore documenting their war crimes. Monika, Thank you so much for joining us, taking some time from your extremely busy schedule. A lot is happening in Africa right now, and you're part of different reporting groups also on the situation in Congo with Ebola right now. So good luck to you with all of this, and we hope to see you again on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today. In 2 weeks' time is the World Refugee Week. We hope we will have you with us because we have a very special report from Sudan, currently the largest humanitarian crisis in the world that impacts not only Sudan, but also many countries around it and Europe as well. So please join us for the World Refugee Week.